Hello, I'm Alex Palanak and I'm Head of Sanctuary at the University of Leicester. Welcome to this presentation, which is the fourth of a series of 4 videos which forms part of a set of training materials on the topic of working with trauma in the Refugee Language Classroom. This Part 4 video focuses on strategies for facilitating growth and well-being in students who have experienced trauma. In this Part 4 video, I will outline what post-traumatic growth is and how we might apply strategies to promote growth and well-being in the refugee language classroom. So, a person who's experienced trauma might go on to develop PTSD, but they might also go on to experience post-traumatic growth, and these two things can potentially coexist. So, what exactly is post-traumatic growth? Basically, it's a positive transformation as a result of a major crisis in which people develop beyond the level of psychological functioning and well-being that they were previously experiencing before the crisis. This concept might be understood through the phrase, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," a concept which has been around for hundreds of years. This is reminiscent of the Japanese tradition of Kintsugi, whereby people mend broken pottery with gold or silver lacquer, understanding that the piece is more beautiful or more meaningful for having been broken and then put together in a way that makes it qualitatively different from what it was before. The breakage and the repairs are understood to be an important part of the history of the object and something which makes it unique and valuable. For me, this resonates with the idea of post-traumatic growth. So, when a potentially traumatic event occurs, an individual's level of functioning often drops dramatically, but then people's responses after that point can differ. Some people end up succumbing to the trauma. It overwhelms them and they may resort to alcohol, drugs, or self-destructive behaviors. For other people, they go into survival mode. They have a far lower quality of life than before. Others may return to their previous level of functioning. They may bounce back because they have resilience. And then others may develop beyond where they were before and experience a positive transformation. So we can call this thriving or post-traumatic growth. So how does post-traumatic growth come about? Well, in some people, after a potentially traumatic event, their core schemas are disrupted and restructured, and they struggle to find meaning and overcome the trauma. And it's through this struggle to find meaning that they experience post-traumatic growth. And this process is characterized by these elements. Things like setting new goals, appreciating life more, having a greater sense of meaning, investing in relationships, increased personal strength, new possibilities for the future, and for some people, a sort of deeper spiritual faith. So how can we potentially go about fostering this in the language classroom? Is it possible? Well, there are certain things that we can do in the language classroom to facilitate post-traumatic growth. First of all, fostering a sense of self-efficacy, a feeling that somebody can succeed in a specific task. This can help people develop a sense of mastery or control. For example, through things like scaffolding the learning process into manageable chunks. Also, flexible optimism in the face of setbacks. This is where, if someone achieves a low test score, for example, we can help them reframe this. Their low test score didn't come about because they are a bad language learner. It's because of specific external factors, like maybe they haven't revised enough in that specific area. So it's helpful for students to see that such situations are temporary, that they are limited to this specific situation, and that there are actions that can be taken to improve their performance next time. This can help to show people that it's not that they're a bad language learner overall, but actually it's just one specific area, and it's something that they have the capacity to change. The next area to look at is vicarious experiences. So we can introduce students to role models who are similar in a number of ways to our students who have overcome adversity and reported growth. So we could use, for example, near-peer role models who might be previous refugee students who have succeeded on the course, and maybe they have gone on now to further study. They might be able to write a testimonial or maybe come in and talk to the class about how they succeeded in their studies. This has been shown to help people feel that they too can also succeed. Social support. This again is something that in the English language classroom we tend to do very well. To give people opportunities to work together, to develop rapport, opportunities to help each other and to show empathy with each other, which can relate to effective intercultural communication. So all of this has been found to promote the development of post-traumatic growth. Meaningful activities are also important. How can we help students feel like what they do in the classroom is meaningful? So, for example, we could help students through expressive activities, perhaps through certain types of reflective writing and keeping journals. There is also a technique called restoring the trauma, which is basically where trauma survivors kind of rewrite their own trauma narrative and they find meaning in what has happened to them. Now, this is not something that I would recommend deliberately trying to bring about in the language classroom, because I don't think it's an appropriate place to do this. And also, most teachers are not trained therapists and may struggle to manage the situation if difficult emotions are brought up for the student, and may not be able to close it down again safely afterwards. But I'm mentioning this here today because I think it's important to be aware that this might happen anyway, almost by accident in the language classroom. So I think it's important to just be aware that this is part of the process of growth and to be aware of what this is if you observe it. Another way of creating meaning is by giving people language to talk about themselves and their experiences. Again, this is something which we quite often do in the language classroom, getting people to express their own opinions and beliefs, for example, but being careful that we are not forcing them to personalize and give details that they don't feel comfortable giving. Regarding the ideal L2 self, this is an idea that was put forward by Dornier and colleagues in 2016. So I'm just going to give you an example of what this might look like on the next slide. Okay, so this is basically a visualization of somebody's future self at a time when they have achieved the level of language proficiency that they want to achieve in order to move forward with their lives. This is an activity that I've done with some of my students in the past, encouraging them to imagine their ideal second language learning self, let's say 5 years in the future, and asking them questions, usually using present tenses to make it more immediate, such as, what are you doing? How are you feeling? And getting them to really step into the shoes of their future self and write some reflections on this page, imagining that they're already there in the future. So this makes it very tangible. It brings it into the present. So here's an example of one of my students' responses to this task. So I must say this student is a very high level student. Not all of my students have such a high level of proficiency, but this student was really able to step into the shoes of her future self and express how she's feeling very satisfied, how she's pursuing her dreams, how she's working as a teacher in a language school, and how she can hear her students and hear their whispers about what they want to be when they grow up. So she's really stepped into that vision. And many students find this a very powerful way of imagining their future. But I would say at this point to be a bit careful with this activity. As I mentioned earlier, if students are still highly traumatized, then this activity in itself might be triggering for them. They may not be able to imagine their future yet, so they may not be ready to spend time thinking about this. This is more of an activity for people who are ready to move on and grow. So again, it is helpful to know your students a bit better before attempting this sort of task and have an idea of whether you feel like this is going to be a suitable activity for them. Factoring in an element of choice may be a sensible way to approach this one. Okay, so back to this slide about ways to foster post-traumatic growth. The final area I'd like to focus on is helping students explore and become more comfortable with risk and change. And this is related to the idea of mindful learning put forward by Ellen Langer. Now, I'm sure you've heard of mindfulness before. Well, this idea has been applied to learning. So we can try to help our students develop an open cognitive style, help them see different perspectives. In the language classroom, this might be things like getting them to do noticing activities rather than just presenting them with rules, getting them to work rules out themselves. But also, when talking about language rules, thinking about when rules apply and when there might be exceptions to the rules. This can help them see rules and trends more flexibly in the future when they come across them. Feeling comfortable with risk, so this links back to social support, good class rapport, feeling comfortable on a visceral level in their social environment. Also, being flexible and receptive to change and helping them see the world as generally predictable, controllable, and good. So we're helping students by giving them structure and routine in the classroom, but also starting to give them more flexibility and perhaps more choices with regard to how certain things happen in the classroom. And all of this can serve to contribute towards developing growth. So let's finish by thinking about the relationship between teaching and therapy. So where is the line? Some people would see it like this and would regard teaching and therapy as completely different things that don't overlap at all. This view sees it as too risky to bring therapeutic elements into the classroom, and I would agree with this to an extent. However, I would see the relationship between teaching and therapy as being more like this. I think there is certainly some overlap between teaching and therapy. I think there's a great opportunity in the language classroom to create a psychosocially protective environment. We can show our students that people see them, hear them, and care about them, that they can build relationships and trust, that they can have control over elements of their lives, that they are capable of learning and growing. So I think that there are many things that we can do, especially because as language teachers, we are very often on the front line in terms of services that refugee students have the most contact with. Many of our students don't have contact with therapists at all, so I think there's a great opportunity in the language classroom to do many things which will help in this respect. However, I would also say that I don't think teaching and therapy are exactly the same thing, and I think we do need to be careful not to overstep the line and open a can of worms that we may not be able to close down again. So I think we need to tread very carefully around certain topics and situations and not deliberately focus on the trauma or anything that is likely to trigger a trauma response. But at the same time, we need to be aware that trauma responses may occur despite our best efforts, and to have up our sleeves a range of ways of dealing with this if they do. Hopefully, these presentations have covered a number of different strategies for trying to deal with these sorts of situations by providing a safe and comfortable space where people can learn and grow without the teacher having to step over that line. So I'd like to leave you with a question, which is, where do you see the line between teaching and therapy? Where is this line in your classroom? Here's the list of references related to this Part 4 presentation. If you're interested in reading more around these topics, I'd particularly recommend Motivational Currents in Language Learning and The Power of Mindful Learning. We've now reached the end of the Part 4 video on the topic of working with trauma in the refugee language classroom. I'd encourage you to now go back to the self-access materials and take a look at Task 9,